So, hi everyone. Thank you so much for being present with us here today in your living room, as we're here in our living room. So I'd also like to acknowledge the lands on which we're speaking, which is the Gadigal lands, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and within the context of acknowledging that it's also Mabo Day, and acknowledging that land was never ceded. And within the, I guess, the broader relationship of thinking about friendship as a way of life, to extended acknowledgement to the wider community of Black deaths in custody and George Floyd in the US right now. So I'm here with Ella. I'm going to be like chatting with you. Ella, hi. Hi. Thanks so much for joining. I guess I wanted to maybe, what I thought I'd do is talk a little bit about how I kind of remember coming to your practice and kind of introduce your practice a little bit. And then the slides that will come up on the screen, and there's some there now. So I think from memory, and please correct me if I'm wrong, we met maybe in 2012 when you were co-artistic director of an artist-run space called Dog Park in Christchurch, and you were kind of very much interested in, I guess, engaging with, I guess, post-quake Christchurch, also working with within the arts community, working with language and how it's presented within a social context. I think you had a period of making like decal stickers for like cars and boats.
Just cars.
Just cars, okay. And then we met again in 2014 when you made a limited edition print book called Going Down, which was co-edited by Jessica Olivieri, about kind of queer feminist performance practices in Sydney. And then I'm going to skip forward to 2018. Oh no, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to kind of think broadly about your practice, which is, if I think through Dog Park and having worked with you in 2014 and the work, your wider body of work, there's a particular interest in like typographic systems, forms of communication, the relationship between printed matter. I think that's a significant concern in your practice. And I guess language and its poetics and how that's distributed. So I guess maybe with that in mind, I could ask you a little bit about a body of work that you started in 2018 that is now on exhibition here at Friendship as a Way of Life, which is when you started working with the LAGANZ archive in Wellington. And perhaps you could talk a little bit about the process of your research, what were you looking for, how did you work, and then I guess what do you kind of, I don't know if conclusion is the right question, but where do you come to at the end?
Yeah, okay. Well, I think that the two key things that I arrived to working with that archive were, how do I read the form of this material? So of course, all of these things are very interesting in terms of their content, but how do I read the form of these things? And being somebody who also has a practice of making books, I'm very much interested in who made this, who printed it, how did it get its way into the world? And then thinking about what is the relationship between this kind of mode of communication and queer experience. So language, printing, all of these things are very much based on the standard, and it's always been this kind of push to perfect some kind of legibility. It's all kind of, you know, to do with, in many ways, the opposite of any kind of fluidity, you know, shifting form. You could also say queerness. So it's thinking, what happens when those two things kind of come up against one another? So I was in Wellington to do a residency with a gallery called Enjoy, and Wellington is where all of the libraries and archives are held, and one of those is LAGANZ, or the Lesbian and Gay Archive of New Zealand, and it's held in the National Library, the Alexander Turnbull Library, and it's not part of their kind of usual or kind of standard system of organising. It kind of sits within it as it's in its own little kind of bubble. And around 1986, there was an arson attack on the archive, and so the library kind of folded LAGANZ in as like a little kind of protective barrier. But so you have this, like, straight away, this instance where you have, you know, the National Library, which is all about ordering, kind of holding on to and then sharing information in a very particular way. But within that, this library that has a completely different system of cataloguing. Thinking about how you catalogue a queer archive is also very complex in and of itself. Thinking about language, thinking about how you categorise things that maybe don't wish to be so. So straight away I'm thinking, how does this kind of structure operate? And so I sort of went in and spent some time with it, and my focus narrowed down to thinking about the kind of history of lesbian feminist serial publications in New Zealand. And so the slide that's up at the moment are a few examples of some of these. They're not all lesbian feminist publications. There's also a Pink Triangle is predominantly a gay publication. Bitches, Witches and Dykes is more of an intersectional moment where you have working class and Māori issues coming into the frame, but that's a lot later. But so I'm thinking, what is this, you know, just what is this history? And also thinking of my own history of knowing, you know, coming through a education experience and learning about communication, publishing, books, language, but there is this massive hole in my kind of knowledge around what is this history in New Zealand of these things. So just starting kind of from the start and going, I want to know this history of publishing, think what it is, and maybe think about how I might read these things from the perspective of, I guess, just like a formal or material kind of thing. And there's a design academic, Teal Triggs, who speaks about this really beautifully, and she says it's the way that the content and the design of this thing come together which makes it a unique enterprise. And I think that's what was kind of leading my thought here. And you know, I won't go into too much detail about the specifics of, you know, all of these publications, but what was most interesting to observe was just the urgency to publish by all of these groups. And they, you know, they kind of travel in and out of happening, not happening. The content shifts incredibly in terms of what that is, but the kind of through line is you have this amazing collective just kind of force to publish and to be public and to, I think, you know, really collect up all of that possible energy that might be found through communication, language, multiples, you know, and they do so much work. And if you have to think, you know, if you think about the kind of earliest publication they looked at in this context, Circle, 1973, New Zealand. This is doing so much work getting into those little corners of rural New Zealand, finding these people that otherwise are like completely dispersed, have no idea about what it might be to find a community that they feel comfortable in. So, you know, with this work, I was really thinking, how can I gesture to some of those visual languages and some of the kind of energy of the work that they were making?
And so can I, and perhaps I'm maybe recapping a little bit of what you've said, but when you're talking about, I guess there's 5 different newspapers, magazines on the screen across a different period of time. Some of them cross over, and then, you know, I don't know how many hundreds you're kind of reading through. What are you reading, like in terms of legibility and in terms of thinking about your history? What do you look for, or what do you start to, I think you kind of talked about what you start to notice, but then I guess what are you drawn to?
I mean, I guess, you know, like there's two things. There's, I guess finding a, you know, you read these histories or you engage with these histories because you're interested in seeing yourself somehow reflected in them, whether you do or not. In a complete parallel might not happen, but I think it's just knowing that there is a resonance of experience, which is, you know, a very kind of rich thing to come across. But, you know, I'm also, when I'm reading these, I'm looking to find, in the context of this project, I'm very much looking to find traces of how it's made, because actually, you know, it's very difficult to find out anything in regards to how these things were made. And I've had some conversations with people who were involved in making, and it's like, oh yeah, this person kind of put that together, or I think that person sort of, you know, had some job where they could like print a few off or whatever. But it's not kind of the urgency to print these things and to make these things is just the flurry of that happening means that all of those, you know, things that have to happen to get it out into the world, they're not recorded. So, you know, there were like little snippets I would find. So it was sort of things like collective editorial practices. One thing I was very much interested in was the idea of like collaging from publications coming from overseas. So they were obscene publications in the 70s, early 80s. So someone kind of like bringing this thing in, buried in their suitcase, cutting it up, putting it into another publication, recirculating it around. So thinking about those other kind of ecosystems of information being shared. And so the works that I made in the next slide in response to this research. So there's 5 screen prints, and each of these is related to a different publication. So Circle, which I mentioned, Pink Triangle, Lip Magazine, Bitches, Witches and Dyke News.
Oh, so hold on, sorry. I just made a connection, Julia, that you might want to flip between. So you're seeing them left, the images of Ella's that you see left to right match the image of the magazine from the previous slide. Okay, so a little bit late to that party, but great. Okay, thank you.
But so, you know, but it's also thinking about how you gesture to something or just try and reference something of the atmosphere of one of these things. I can't, of course, you know, transmit that full kind of history of things. So they're very much, you know, it's thinking about how can I, what is it to think about taking this appreciation for these things and bringing them back into, you know, a contemporary frame. You know, alongside this project, when I originally exhibited it, I made a collaborative publication with a group of other practitioners. So it was really about, I guess, continuing that cycle.
So you made a contemporary, I guess, made a contemporary queer magazine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I feel like maybe if we move to the next slide, please, Julia, and my next question might come to me, which is, or just casually cycling through, but the thing about the history of these archives, and I'm thinking about the history of going through an archive or a queer archive, which is actually referred to as lesbian gay archives, and thinking about the slippages of language, the different use of language, the different use of politics, and whilst you're kind of reading through these magazines, you might be identifying and disidentifying at the same time, and there's a contentious space of politics, particularly and language that is not used or identified with, especially in relation to, say, race or trans visibility, let's say. So I'm going to skip back maybe to an earlier work, which is also in this exhibition called Q, which may be in the next slide or the slide after, or, yep, that's it, great. And so this work kind of speaks a little bit to the relationship of the word queer and its kind of institutionalization of that word, or the categorization of the word, or the indexing. I think, is that possibly something that you could kind of talk about? These are like large library signs?
Yeah, I mean, so materially they're using a institutional signage kind of system. That's something you might find in the library, yes, or anywhere else in an institution like a university.
Right.
And so your comment around the slipperiness of language, I think, is definitely part of what I was thinking here, and dealing so often as I am with these little kind of strange pictures that we refer to as words, and thinking about how does this come to be a thing that we all agree on. And so thinking about the word queer and thinking about working through something like a lesbian and gay archive, thinking about how language is quite often not available for people at different points in time, and how reading back over those histories can be quite confronting. So thinking about what is this exchange between these signs, words and ideas, how does typography work to kind of link these things up? And I think this idea that we're always deciding what these words mean, and the word queer is being constantly, I guess, renegotiated as to what that is. This work, I was thinking about that, and I was reading a book by Ariel Goldberg called The Estrangement Principle, which is, you know, I think in lots of ways considering the usefulness or not of the word queer as a label. And so I was making this work originally in 2007 to 2017 for an exhibition at UNSW Galleries. So part of this is included in Friendship as a Way of Life, just one of the panels. But basically what I've done is collected the typography from the spines of all the library books in various university libraries which contain the word queer. And so they're referencing, I guess, walking down a section of a shelf, and you see this, I guess, mapping of this word, but through the lens of an academic context. And of course it's what's there, but in most instances, and maybe UNSW's representation, which is quite slight, it's really about omission, is what isn't there. So it's how can I kind of gesture towards this in a way that's quite economic, and I guess it's thinking of collecting, representing. I have in the past talked about works like this as a kind of Xerox documentary. It's quite fast, it's just a little glimpse, and it also, I used a photocopier to collect the spines. So, you know, it's thinking about, and actually I made this before the previous work, and so I think that as I was coming to working with the LAGANZ archive, I was kind of had this experience of thinking about language working or not working and being a slippery, strange thing. And so that was definitely in my mind going into the other.
So this marks it's kind of like, it's like almost the beginning of your the beginning of your LAGANZ research. It's pre-LAGANZ. Can I just move us along? I'm just at the speed of lightning here. I'm thinking of you as a little bit of a detective, and it seems like your research and your practice is very much focused on or engages with a visibility and invisibility, and this kind of you're playing with this relationship between revealing and concealing. And so perhaps in the kind of Q work, you're revealing and concealing at the same time in that work. In the LAGANZ work, 5 readings, you're revealing. But then in the next slide, I think we come across potentially a series of paintings in which you are again revealing revealing and concealing, but working. Oh my God, you're very much working with the idea of portraiture, letters and language, but again you're working with I guess an archive of like a Western archive of women and letters and love letters between lesbians from a particular era. Maybe, I don't know, I'm kind of can you elaborate on that a little bit for me, please?
Well, when I think of letters, and one of the other works in this show, this is a series of 4 or 5 paintings called Letters, and one of the other works in the show is called What is a Letter, which is taken from the title of an essay by an academic called Johanna Drucker. And she has this beautiful way of reflecting on this question, what is a letter, by talking about how a letter is, of course, this formal thing that we have at hand, but it's also something which is densely coded with the kind of cultural context that it was made in, and also just the idea of what a letter might be at any given time. So how is it that this letter can be read as something that's kind of embodying all of these things? And this also was folding in another research interest of mine, which is medieval illuminated initials. So this practice of pre-printing press, somebody illuminating the first letter of a body of text. And so quite often these would be painted, and they would sometimes have a story which was related to the text that was coming. Maybe the story that was kind of illustrated within the letter could be completely unrelated. They might just be decorated. But this idea of really drawing out this potential of the, I guess, decorated letter. And so, as you've mentioned, this idea of letters in terms of like a written letter exchange, this work is, I suppose, playing with these different ideas of letters. And so I think of these as illuminated initials, letters drawn out of these kind of written letter. And thinking about what is it, at this point in time that I'm kind of referring to with these figures, the private space of the written letter is something which is, quite an interesting site of exchange. It could be coded, often might be coded. This idea of desire or fugitive desire, or the ways in which communication may be subversive, or how it might use those channels, those kind of standard channels, but in a different kind of register, was also part of what I was thinking about with these.
So does that kind of connect to just thinking around illumination and this idea of did you say fugitive?
Mm-hmm.
So this idea of fugitive or danger or a scariness, or I'm thinking around like the shift from illumination manuscripts and the scribe into mechanization, mechanization of the printing press. I should just say the printing press.
Well, so sorry to interrupt.
No, please do.
If we move to the next slide, so I have this oh, there it is. I have this one of my absolute favorite initials is here.
Is that an S?
It's a D.
Oh.
And this initial is maybe the first instance of a self-portrait of a woman artist in the Western context. So it's an illuminated initial by I think, late 12th century nun called Gouda. And so in the inscription that's wrapping around the kind of inside of the letter form, it reads, Gouda, sinful woman, wrote and illustrated this book. And she has her hand kind of raised with these long fingers, kind of in this gesture of the witness, in this long task. And so I'm quite interested in thinking about, I guess, the stories that might be hidden in letters, but then I have to contrast that one of the first depictions of a print shop. And so this is death in the printers. And so there's this moment where communication and reproduction is very spooky. And so early printing was regarded as kind of like a dark art magic, this idea that somebody may be able to, an image may be able to be reproduced over and over again, without the hand, once somebody is gone, was just kind of cloaked in this sort of persistent spookiness until it is that printing and typography starts talking about itself and then becomes something which is able to be kind of understood. But up until that point, it was kind of just mind-blowing and therefore must be something to do with magic. But so I'm really interested in this threshold between the hand and the machine, and what are the similarities of those and what are the differences. So you have the scribe or the monk or the nun trying to be as much like a machine as possible, working to, by hand produce these books. And then you have the, essential inability, though, of us to engage the kind of endless rotation, to be a machine. So what's that kind of threshold? And so a lot of my work is also thinking about the mechanics or not of making this, of kind of communicating this. And so I think that's why I painted those initials.
Right, I was going to come back to that. So the painting the initials is the kind of moving back to the hand.
Well, because it was suddenly this moment of going, it wouldn't make sense to print these.
Right. Yeah.
I need to paint them.
Okay.
But I think though that also leads into where I've arrived to with the new work that I've made for Friendship as a Way of Life. Okay.
So this is the work made based on the Wicked Women magazine, which is, I guess, a kind of magazine from, I think, went for around 10 years, from the late 80s to the late 90s. And you could actually listen, just a little plug here, to Kelly Doley interviewing DJ Gemma about the Wicked Women nights, which were like fundraising nights that went to the contribution of the production of these magazines, but just thinking through the idea of like the magazine came about through a kind of challenging the kind of status quo of, I guess, lesbian feminism, trying to push away and find an identity that's outside of that, or working with ideas of dominance and power, surrender and submission, and that the magazine was started quite simply, with a typewriter that I think had a faulty key in the typewriter, which was a W. And so every time W, either wicked woman or any other reference to that needed to be typed, they had to use a finger to put the pressure on the type key in order to make the mark, which is a kind of beautiful, I think, and kind of connection between this idea of the scribe, the machine, and the hand in the terms of the mechanization of production. So do you think I could maybe ask you to talk a little bit about the process of what you have with these works in its glyph of body? And I think maybe can we talk a little bit about the role of the body, of thinking about the body and the concept of pressure when you're thinking about your work?
So when the opportunity came around to make a new work for the show, it felt like, you know, given my experience working with these publishing contexts in New Zealand, it would be wonderful to be able to, you know, have some time thinking about histories here. And so I went down to the Lesbian and Gay Archives in Melbourne, and quite specifically looking for publications that had come out of Sydney. And I had done a little bit of research, and it felt like Wicked Woman represented quite an interesting departure point from some of the other publications that I'd looked at. And it's a little bit later.
Why was it an interesting departure point?
Well, I think because it was a little bit later, and and also I think this very specific move away from a focus on lesbian feminist politics, thinking about the relationship between the space of the page as a physical space and its relationship to a social space outside of that, and the kind of back and forth between those is something I'm interested in. So how can they kind of mirror one another? And so when I watched this little documentary made by Anna Brownfield, in which Jasper, one of the founders of the magazine, as you've mentioned, speaks about this broken typewriter, and suddenly I was like, amazing, because nobody ever talks about, as I've kind of mentioned, no one talks about how these things are made. Mm-hmm. And then this idea of the broken W, but the kind of just work around to make that technology work to be able to communicate, I think really captures so much of the sort of spirit of publishing in this space. And so my process was to think, how can I, like, suddenly I have this letter form that is capturing, you know, so many different kinds of, I guess, pressures. You have the pressure of trying to publish with a slightly dysfunctional sort of technology setup. You have the pressure of the body, and like in a very kind of straightforward way of making the impression of the letter on the paper. And so I was thinking about what these letters carry with them and their form is a kind of mapping of that pressure. And so the work is all of these, or I collected all of them, but all of them aren't in this work in the gallery, of these W's from the first issue, and reproducing them at this kind of giant scale until they kind of break down again. They sort of look like I don't know, they're like you know, a weather map or some kind of smoky kind of, there's this, it's like the process of making it doesn't really happen anymore, but the process of making a letter, like a piece of type that would be used for typesetting, as a punch cutter will kind of chisel away the reverse of the letter, and then the test letter is kind of communicating as it should. It'll be held over a flame so that soot builds on it to make an impression of what that is, to see what it looks like. And it's called a smoke-proof or a fume. And so when I was making these, I was also really thinking of that. It's like this testing of the letter to see if it's a W yet. But of course, all of the W's are a bit, you know, they've got a lot of personality. They have the pressure of the body and the moment and the atmosphere, and I guess this idea of the letter at any given moment.
And the slippage of the identity, which is another kind of beautiful way of thinking about, like, of coming into and going out of and moving through, like of being in some ways.
Yeah, and so the materially, the work, there are 15 prints of these selection of W's, and so the way that they're installed is they have these flat bars kind of holding the paper to the wall, but at a more narrow width than the width of the paper. So the pressure of the bars and the pressure of the paper has it bow out from the wall like this, which I think, you know, as a nod to the multiple or the, I don't know, mechanized production alongside this pressure of the body, I think it's those two things coming up against each other again.
Cool. I was just pausing in wonder and wondering if there might be any questions from people, pets, for Ella, in regards to practice, life.
I haven't had any questions come through yet, but we have had one comment, which is someone loving your comment, Ella, these strange shapes that we call words, which is really lovely. I thought maybe I'll ask a question myself, and that gives everyone a little bit of time to think and respond and write one themselves. I was just wondering, hearing you talk, Ella, about how illuminated manuscripts and letters contain really personal stories within them, almost like secret stories, and are very individualized. In developing your own work, you're looking at archival material, but I'm also wondering if there's, you know, part of your personal story, personal life that comes through as well.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose maybe thinking of Sarah's question earlier about, you know, what am I looking for and looking through these archives and what kind of resonates. You know, I think that in going to these particular archives and working in that space definitely reflects, you know, like my context and thinking, what is this history that I don't know? I feel like it is definitely relevant. I've made another work for the show, which I haven't talked about, but it will be released soon, which is a font, and this font is I've asked 26 friends, colleagues, lovers to find a letter from their world which maybe connects to their queer experience, and contribute that to make this font. And I guess I feel like in lots of ways it's quite a you know, the work is actually mapping out, because I'm just working with people who are kind of in my network in life from over the years. So, like, in a way, I feel like that's, even though everybody's kind of going to their own archive to find these letters, I think in that kind of collation of people, in a way, that feels like quite a, you know, it's like a much more kind of personal kind of context that I'm working in. And so what will happen is we'll have these 26 letters that'll come together. I'll prepare them as a font, and this idea of like reconsidering or kind of, I don't know, hacking what a font might be, because it'll be pretty wild. Each of these letters, but the most beautiful thing is though, each of these letters come in, and the stories that are kind of attached to these letters from the kind of lives that they have, and, you know, everybody's kind of various spaces. So incredible. So, you know, like, it's just like collating actually 26 quite personal stories into this, into this ordinarily quite sort of restrained format.
So you're using it's kind of like you use maybe your life, your environment, your relationships inform your material, but your work isn't necessarily confessional or autobiographical. Would you like just to?
Oh yeah, it's not. Maybe that's next.
And the font's available as of next week, so we'll be releasing that as part of Forms of Being Together next week. I'll let you both know we haven't had any more questions come through, but I thought I would just see if either of you had any last comments or questions, Sarah, for Ella, before we wrap up today.
I feel like the audience participants online, or I need a little bit more time as well, and my question might come later. You an
one
email.
that came through actually.
Oh.
So I'm just going to read it out as is. All right. So you mentioned your research at ALGA in Melbourne and 80s publications, but also 70s era work in New Zealand. I remember a friend talking about how the AIDS crisis illuminated a whole generation of designers from that time. Is this something that you've noticed working with these archives?
Yeah, actually, in maybe if I speak about in the context of LAGANZ, just because I had much more time there, because of course these archives that we look at, they're not neutral in any way. Like, of course, they have they're shaped by and kind of conditioned by and formed by whatever has come to kind of collect them. And LAGANZ definitely had a focus, or a really large part of its collection, around homosexual law reform in New Zealand and the AIDS crisis, and the ephemera and designers and artists working in that space, just the most incredible kind of collections of material. That was like a really considerable, kind of collection in there. And I think also in the Australian Lesbian and Gay archives, my sense was that was also a big part of their collection. It's that working with archives though, I've had to go quite often. You have a little window to spend time in there, and I just feel like I could just freeform, just want to kind of experience as much of that material as possible and kind of learn from it. So I haven't had, I haven't had a deep chance to spend time with that, but I've definitely noticed like a very big presence in both of those spaces.
Thanks, Ella. We've had a couple more comments, but also one last question. How do you think about friendship with respect to your work in this exhibition?
Yeah, well, I think that the font that I just mentioned, the idea of different ways that you might make communities or families, and different ways that might resonate, as the kind of importance or weight of that and how that might resonate. Just that kind of process of going through like my own kind of network friendship and thinking about what that is, I think that really brings, that was really very present. And of course, working with these collections and seeing or reading, whether it's reading because one thing that really struck me with the early publications in New Zealand is reading through letters that are exchanged through the publication. And what's so amazing about the letters is it feels like they're so just this like on the ground trajectory of what life is like in these different places and how important those relationships are, friendships are, and they might have to be kind of carried through this printed matter, but like just the weight of those is incredible, and you realize like this is the like it's just so crucial.
So I mean, you've got friendship within the context of the publications that are very much produced through friendship and a degree of intimacy, you imagine, through the people as well as the communications that's happening. That's certainly the case for like Wicked Women, but then also the case of the letters, that's a friendship of correspondence that you're working with in that context. And then there's the alphabet of friendship, for want of a better name, that you've kind of produced within that. And perhaps, you know, dare I say that the friendship that you also find like within a history of, especially with the earlier publications, or at least, you know, pre-internet, is the sense of belonging or friendship that you might find through these publications if you can't find them in your immediate home or environment or the friendship group that you are in, if you're thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I guess because they're kind of like, well, at one point in time anyway, the ultimate kind of like broadcast tool in terms of packaging, communicating, circulating. And I think, again, I'm quite often am involved in making publications. It's inherently a collaborative process, you know, sometimes with friends, often with friends, and I think all of that definitely feeds into this idea of an idea of friendship.
We have just one last question, and maybe we'll call it at that, unless you have more you want to say, but it kind of jumps off what you were just discussing and sort of what you were just listing there, Sarah. And someone asks, what are the letters in the paintings? If you could just talk a little bit more about those, and I'll pop them up on the screen as well.
Yeah, so I think, again, this idea of the, going back to this word of fugitive or hidden. But so on the left, we have two V's. So a V for Virginia Woolf and a V for Vita Sackville West. And then on the right-hand side, a G for Gertrude Stein and an A for Alice B. Tolkis. And I like the idea that formally they move in and out of a letter, but then also, I guess, these forms of windows or clouds or doors or foliage or bridges. So this idea of moving between a space which may or may not be kind of clear to move through. So there's definitely a play with cryptic or crypsis within these things, just like slightly buried under complete legibility.